Each winter, adult gray seals come to shore on Seal Island, a national wildlife refuge off the coast of Maine. In the midst of falling snow and freezing temperatures, the seals give birth, nurse their pups, and mate. We've seen pups grow rapidly on mother's milk, shed their baby fur, and begin to enter the sea for the first time. While island life isn't necessarily easy at this time of the year, it is winter off the coast of Maine. Gray seals are a success in an unforgiving and changing environment. Hi again, this is Mike Fitz, your resident naturalist with explore.org, the world's largest live nature cam network. And we're in the midst of gray seal season on explore.org. To help us learn more about gray seals, I'm joined by Dr. Stephanie Wood, a marine biologist and assistant professor of seal biology at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. Stephanie studies gray and harbor seals off the coast of New England and is an expert in their population dynamics, which is something that we're going to talk about during the chat today because these animals have undergone a considerable population change during the last several decades. Stephanie, thanks so much for joining me today. I'm excited to learn more about gray seals from you.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. I always enjoy the opportunity to talk about seals.
And I'm curious to know how you became interested in marine mammals and seals in particular. What's your sort of backstory?
Sure. So I'm actually one of those people that as a child, I loved sort of all sorts of animals in biology. And even in particular, when I was probably around 7 or 8, I received a stuffed animal seal, and I just thought it was the greatest thing, and I learned more and more about them, and I just found them to be these really interesting animals, mostly because they split their time between living in the ocean and really traveling through large distances in the ocean, and then some coming back to land or ice for certain parts of their life history, including, as you mentioned, things like giving birth and nursing and mating. So there are these really interesting species that sort of straddle two quite different environments.
And seals can be seen, regularly off the coast of New England right now, in the Northeast, U.S. coast. But that wasn't the case in the mid-20th century. It was quite rare for a long time to actually see any seals in these waters. And gray seals in particular were largely extinct from the U.S. At this time. So what led to their disappearance from New England?
Sure. So throughout the Northeast, as you mentioned, there were bounty systems in place, both state bounties in Massachusetts and Maine, and then there were local bounties in coastal towns. And just like we had for things like coyotes as well, where animals were perceived as some sort of either threat or competition for resources, there were systems in place where people would go out and hunt an animal, and they would actually turn the animal in. They'd either turn in a nose or a tail, usually was the piece that they would turn in, and they would be paid anywhere between $1 and $5 for each seal that they killed. And so this went on for quite some time, to the point where, as you mentioned, gray seals were locally extinct in U.S. waters by somewhere in the sort of late 1930s, 1940s, and harbor seals, although there was always a residual population in Maine, were also at very low numbers. What's interesting about the bounties is there was actually a lot of cheating. So in other parts of the world, in Northern Europe, for example, they've been able to use bounty statistics to basically figure out, well, how many seals were there before these bounty systems went into place. Unfortunately for us, there's a lot of cheating in the bounty where people would take one seal pelt and make, 5 or 6 tails. So we can't use the numbers are not reliable. But we know because of this, there was a sort of long pressure on the populations of sort of sustained hunting for quite some time. So in Massachusetts in 1962, that changed and gray seals were protected. And then, of course, in 1972, the Federal Marine Mammal Protection Act was passed, which gave blanket protection to all marine mammals, whales and dolphins and all sorts of pinnipeds, which are the seals and sea lions and walruses. And so that protection was one important component of their recovery. A couple of other important pieces is that they are really Northwest Atlantic populations. The gray seals in particular, we know from satellite tags that show us where the animals move to and some genetics, which tells us about relatedness, that the animals you find in the Gulf of St. Lawrence and on Sable Island off Nova Scotia and in the Gulf of Maine where Seal Island is, and even down by Nantucket, it's one population. And so we know that that sort of residual population in Canada was a really important source for the animals that recolonized the US.
And that was actually, I think, going to be my follow-up question: is where did the seals disperse from back into U.S. waters? But you answered that quite well. So we'll move on from there. But kind of a related question to their population growth overall is how in your opinion, how important do you think changing public attitudes towards wildlife and legislation like the Marine Mammal Protection Act, how important were those things in helping gray seals recover?
Sure. So I think there were lots of different things that sort of converged to allow for their recovery. And I always like to say that, gray seals are really a conservation success story because they were gone from this habitat. We know from archaeological records and historic accounts that both gray and harbor seals were found throughout the Northeast US, down into Long Island Sound and even further south. So we know that they were part of this ecosystem prior to those bounty systems. So the Marine Mammal Protection Act certainly was really important in that it released that hunting pressure. The source population that I mentioned on Sable Island was really important. Part of the Marine Mammal Protection Act was sort of a shift in humans. What did you call it now? I don't remember. In the way humans sort of value wildlife or think about management, that Congress actually passed this law that said this is not what we want to do to wildlife, and we're going to change this and protect these populations. So that was really important. And the other interesting piece of seal recovery in the U.S. is that is the question of habitat. So if we look at where gray seals, for example, have their pups, so Seal Island, which is right behind you there, in the mid-coast area, that was actually used by the Navy for bombing practice. And so obviously that's not a great place to have a pup if there might be bombs being dropped on you. And then in the 1970s, the Navy transferred that to U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And so that became a refuge. So obviously there's sort of limited human activity on there, which is also really important for seals, especially when they're having their pups. No Man's Island, which is down in Nantucket Sound, has a similar history. And really, when you look at human behavior, we use islands much less frequently than we did, say, in 1900. And so in some ways, we hear a lot about habitat loss and habitat destruction, but with seals in certain pockets, habitat actually opened back up to them, which is really important, especially in looking at these refuges. There's several U.S. Fish and Wildlife refuges that are key to the gray seals.
And Seal Island is one of those wildlife refuges that's closed to the public. I mean, it is devoted to seabirds and marine mammals and whatever other organisms can make a living there.
Right.
And it's been fascinating over the past several months for me, of course, to watch the animals on the island through our webcams. But what can you explain, maybe for somebody who's new to the cameras or new to gray seals, what life events occur during this annual congregation of gray seals on Sea Island?
Right. So that's a great word to use for it, an annual congregation, because that's exactly what's happening. So these are marine mammals, and they spend a lot of their time feeding throughout, much of the Northwest Atlantic. And so part of reproducing when you're moving through a vast habitat is, one challenge to reproduction is finding a mate, right? And so these animals are dispersing over hundreds of miles. And so their life history system is such that they are all on the same cycle. And so the moms come ashore, the moms who are pregnant come ashore, and they give birth basically over a 6-week time period. Yep, there's a little pup and mom there. And so this does a couple of things. They go back to a predictable spot. Gray seals are highly philopatric, which means that they have a tendency to actually return to where they were born when they're sexually mature and when they're joining the breeding population. The moms have their pups, and you saw that one picture. There was sort of a really thin pup with sort of yellowish white fur. That's a newborn. And then the moms nurse the pups for about 3 weeks. And then after that time, the mom weans the pup and she's ready to mate. And so the other piece of this is that then males are there as well. So all the reproductive animals go to the same spots along the coast. And then you're not sort of swimming around, from here to George's Bank to the Bay of Fundy trying to find a mate. You're going to Seal Island to find a mate. And so it's a predictable place where they can find each other. And so in terms of life events, the pups are born, the pups are nursed, they're weaned quite abruptly. So once the mom is done nursing, she basically leaves and heads back out to sea. And then the pups hang out, which you can probably see now on the camera, compared to 2 or 3 weeks ago where there would have been a lot of adults. Over time, what we see is towards the end of the season is a higher frequency of pups than adults. And that's because the pups end up sort of hanging out after they're weaned. And they go through this post-weaning molt where they lose all that white fluffy fur and grow in their juvenile coat. And then eventually they actually go out and teach themselves how to feed. So again, a couple of big life events, birth, nursing, and mating are all happening within about a 6-week time period at these sites.
And the pups grow extremely rapidly during the first few weeks of their lives. And I don't think it's that much of hyperbole to say it is an extremely rapid rate of growth. I mean, they gain about 3 pounds of mass per day, I've read on mother's milk. And gray seal milk is some of the fattiest milk of all mammals. I've read it has a fat content as much as 60% by volume. And then on top of this, the mothers are fasting during this nursing period. So how does a mother gray seal accommodate her pups' nutritional needs as well as their own during this time?
Right, great question. So gray seals from an evolutionary standpoint are ice seals. And so you see that's in part why those pups have that white fur when they're first born that camouflages them into sea ice. And so what they do, because they often live in these sort of unpredictable environments, their nursing period is very succinct and they have this rapid weight growth, weight addition, I should say, as you mentioned. So what the mom is doing, because you're right, she's not feeding during this 3-week period. So what she's doing is she's taking the blubber in her body and she is converting that into milk. And so what you may notice, depending on when in the season you've looked at the cameras, is early on the moms are quite big. They have this layer of blubber, but over time they convert that to milk. So reproduction is really very energetically costly for the moms. So they want to be as fat, have as much blubber as they can so that they have a lot of reserves, because the more reserves they have, the fatter they can get their pup. And the fatter the pup is, the longer that pup, who then has to figure out how to eat on its own, has a little bit of reserve still for it. So it's a really succinct cycle. Part of that shorter lactation period is, again, especially if you're thinking, even in places like the Gulf of St. Lawrence or the Baltic Sea, gray seals are pupping on ice, which is a less predictable environment. So the chances of you keeping track of your pup for 6 months are not as good. Chances of being able to stick with your pup for 3 weeks is much more likely. So it's all about kind of getting these life history steps done in as quickly as you can, because there's a chance you're going to be separated. The moms and pups are going to be separated. The other piece of this is once the mom actually weans the pup, she comes right into estrus. And so she actually gets pregnant right again after weaning the pup. And seals, as other species, things like otters have this as well. They have something called delayed implantation. And so that fertilized egg divides a few times and then it just goes into a suspended state. And that allows the mom to then go out to sea to forage and eat and rebuild her resources, rebuild her blubber layer so that she's then in good enough physical shape to then carry another pregnancy again. And so we think sometime around March, implantation happens, and again, keeps them all on this same cycle so that by December, the pregnant moms are coming back to these sites to do it all again.
And this year we've seen many very fat seal pups. Some actually were still provided milk by their mothers after they had what it looked like almost completely molted. I mean, this is a photo here
Yep.
of one that's not quite there, but we've seen some that look, really like molted, like they've shed all that
Right.
baby fur. Is it typical for seal mothers to nurse their pups for that long? And what we've seen this year say about the health of the mothers who are
Yeah.
able to nurse their pups for that duration?
Sure. So certainly in general, we use what we call weaning mass, which is the weight of the pup when the mom weans it. We can use that as a proxy for maternal health or maternal condition, because we know a mom that's bigger, that has more blubber, she can convert more of her own resources into fat, and thereby weaning a fatter pup. In terms of the molt stage, there are sort of general categories. There's a 5-stage molt progression, which we talk about, with stage 1 being newborns, which are those sort of really skinny, kind of yellowy colored animals. Yep. And then they get a little bit rounder, and then they get really round where they look almost like torpedoes. So that's a little new pup. So we know generally sort of the progression of that molt stage, but like anything in nature, there's always variability. So, maybe one pup would be a molt stage at day 15 that another pup is at day 17. And so there's a little bit of overlap amongst the stages, and a little bit of variability, just like we see in all of nature. So that's sort of a general guideline. Usually in general, if they're fully molted, generally they are weaned, but that's not to say that some individuals aren't hanging on to mom as long as they can.
Yeah, I think, when you think of it from the pup's perspective, it makes sense to
Yeah,
to stick with mom and keep mom around as long as possible, because you want those
right.
energy reserved.
Yeah.
Do we know anything about the mortality of newly weaned pups, and some of the hurdles that they face when they enter the ocean for the first time?
Sure. So, not so much specifically about the pups that are being born on Seal Island, but we know from studies in other areas, say pups that are born on Sable Island, or pups that are born in parts of the UK. We know that first year mortality is pretty steep. The estimate generally is somewhere between 40 and 60%. That's pretty high for a first year. So seals, like other large animals, what we see is early survival can be sort of low, but if you're a seal and you can make it to be age, say 5, then there's a good chance you're going to survive for the next 20, 25 years. So there's sort of a steep incline, and then you sort of plateau in terms of survival rates. And a lot of that really has to do with the fact that these are very young animals. It's somewhat related to how much blubber they have, because they can use that as an energy resource, and how quickly they're able to learn to forage on their own, because no one's teaching them how to go find those fish. They're doing it on their own. So there's a lot of factors that can impact them and their survival.
And the activities that we see on the gray seal cam, the activities, so to
Mhm.
speak, like giving birth and mating, they're vital to the species existence. Those activities only offer a brief glimpse into their lives, however.
Mhm.
So, what's their life like the rest of the year? The
Right.
11 months or 10 months that they're away from Seal Island.
Yep. So we know they're obviously spending some of that time in the water eating, especially right post the reproductive season. We know from, again, things like satellite tags and animals that have either flipper tags or brands and genetics, that they're moving around from site to site. We know these animals are traveling. We have some information from satellite tags, seals that were born on Sable Island. We have information from animals that have been rehabilitated and released from stranding centers, and these animals move fairly quickly. There's an ongoing project right now. Some of my colleagues are tagging pups that are being weaned to, again, look for things like movements and first year survival and things like that. So we know that they're moving around. They do haul out at other times of the year. Again, they
Okay.
spend time at sea, and they will haul out and sort of rest on a beach, on a rocky island, wherever they are. They will haul out in the spring to molt. So just like birds molt, if you watch the puffins in the summer, they will, grow in basically a new coat of fur, and that happens in the spring, roughly March to May. So they're very predictable at this time of year, and then we know again in the spring we can often see, other than the pups that were just born because they've just molted, but everyone else comes out again to molt and grow in new fur. And then throughout the year, they'll haul out for a while to rest, but they're moving around a lot for sure.
And how challenging, we've talked a lot about their, their populations and their population recovery and their natural history, but how challenging can it be to study a marine mammal that only comes to shore for brief times of the year and also inhabits a broad area of the ocean? It's not like they're sticking around into one little bay, like you said.
Right. No, right. For all those reasons, it can be challenging. The marine mammalogists who study whales would say at least they come to land part of the time, so we have a chance. But it is challenging. There are some long-term sites where people have been, sort of collecting information that has provided insight into things like life history. On Sable Island, they've done a lot of work tagging or branding animals that's provided a lot of information on survival rates and age at first reproduction rates and things. But that's a massive amount of human hours and effort and decades for people to be out there and refinding animals. A lot of the newer technology and newer tags is providing information because that allows us to see what they're doing when they're not hauled out. We can see if we get a ping from a tag that's 30 miles offshore, that provides information. But it's definitely tricky. And even with looking at the pupping season, it happens over a 6-week period. And so even to capture, well, how many pups are being born on Seal Island this year? Well, you could go out on January 10th and count all those pups, but not everyone's been born yet. So the other challenge is that given this reproductive event takes place over 6 weeks, there's never one single day when all the pups that are born in a season are available to be counted. And so we oftentimes either look at sort of trends in numbers or there are ways to correct for that. But there are challenges for sure to collect this information.
And the Gulf of Maine, where Seal Island is located, is one of the fastest warming bodies of water on the planet. And the climate science models, computer models, suggest it's likely just to get warmer over the next several decades. And how warm it gets really just depends on how soon we tackle climate change. But what might the consequences of a warming climate be for gray seals and other marine mammals in the Gulf of Maine?
So I think there's a couple of ways to think about that. Obviously, warming waters is going to, in some ways, change all of the species that are living in the Gulf of Maine. And so while gray seals are generalists in terms of the food that they eat, it's always a consideration. If there's a real shift in what prey is available, that can impact species. Depending on sort of nutrient content and fat and protein content of the fish and other species that are available. And these are mammals that are adapted clearly to a cold environment. As you said in your intro, their pups are being born 20 miles offshore in Maine in the winter. So, they're clearly adapted to a cooler environment. So I think that a warming trend could obviously impact them as well in terms of limiting potentially their distribution, or at least where things like pupping takes place.
So, we've talked about, some of the changes that the seal population has undergone, some of the challenges that individual seals, face in their survival. I'd like to kind of talk a little bit about how seals impact, humans in some ways, and the ecology of the shorelines in the northeast U.S. Because gray and harbor seals are, they're, like you said, they're native to the northeast U.S. coast. They're quite dramatically over the last several decades, and that doesn't happen in isolation. Nothing really in nature happens in a vacuum. So how has the growing number of seals influenced maybe the distribution of predators off of the coast of New England?
So I'm gonna send you to a shark biologist to get detailed answers to that question.
Okay.
right? I mean, we need to, and there's a big shift right now to really think about sort of ecosystem sciences, right? That, to your point, none of these species are functioning in a vacuum, and they're all interrelated, as are humans. And so the way I like to think about sort of the recovery of seals, and then I'm sure some people are thinking in terms of other predators, recovery of some of the shark species, it's indicative of a healthy ecosystem, right? Because we know that these species historically were part of this ecosystem, and then they were not because of human intervention, basically removing them. And so in terms of basically ocean health, people often talk about seals as sentinels for ocean health, right? Because they are connected to both land and water, and we can at least see them some of the year, right? There's a lot of other marine species that are impacted by ocean health, but we can't see them as readily. And so seals are this great opportunity to kind of see what's happening. And so when you see these large predators recover in an ecosystem, it's really a benefit. It means conservation efforts are working. And we're still sort of learning as these predators return to certain areas, the benefits that there are. People look at things like Yellowstone, where when wolves returned, there was all this benefit to other species in that ecosystem. There's evidence of sort of ecosystem engineering is a term you might hear, where the presence of seals, although seals are eating some fish, they sometimes focus in on one size of fish. So if you take certain species of fish are actually cannibalistic, and so bigger fish in the same species are eating smaller fish. So if you have seals that are removing some of those bigger fish, it actually might be healthier in the long run for that fish population, because it's releasing some of that pressure and allowing multiple generations to flourish. And so we're still sort of learning about all the benefits of having these predators return. That doesn't mean that it hasn't come with some concern as well. And the tricky part is really kind of think sort of what are our new baselines, and that's sometimes a hard thing for humans who, if you've lived on the coast of Maine all of your life, or you've lived on Cape Cod and you're used to seeing one thing on these shorelines, and now it does look dramatically different when you go and you see all these seals, or you hear of a shark sighting. And that's hard. That's sort of humans shifting their expectations of what wildlife looks like in an area. And I understand that, but I always try to focus on the positive, that these species and populations recovering is a good sign really for all of us, because we're part of this ecosystem as well.
Yeah, and I think that point that you brought up of shifting baselines is a very interesting one to consider. And I know that's one that an idea that's really thrown around in conservation biology quite a bit, because most of our existence in the last 100 years, and humanity's existence, for most species across the planet and a lot of ecosystems, has been one sort of a trend towards poverty, ecological impoverishment, where species go extinct and there's just fewer animals overall. And with gray seals, we're seeing sort of like the opposite. We gave them an opportunity to come back. So our baseline had shifted to this point where we saw so few of them. We got used to that. And a lot of people thought maybe that was normal. Now it's maybe trending back in the opposite direction. And there's really no real balance in nature. But yeah, I think that's something for all of us to consider when we think about conserving animals, is just where those baselines are going to shift over time, and what that means to our cultures and how we relate to the wildlife overall.
Right.
Just a really fascinating thing for me to think about during my free time.
Yeah. You're right, and I would say sort of along those lines of sort of balancing nature is eventually nature does sort of balance out, probably when you think about something like carrying capacity, right? Which is this idea that in any given ecosystem, it can sustain a certain number of individuals. And if you're looking at the Gulf of Maine, it's lobsters and redfish and hake and seals and sharks or whatever else is there, and nature does find a balance sometime. And we seal biologists are often asked, well, how many seals are supposed to be here? And that's a really tricky question to answer, because we don't have a good handle on what that sort of pre-exploitation population was. And the reality is that, to your point, the ecosystem has changed a bit since 1700. But you can look at natural populations and you can see some balancing out. For seals, we can see things like pup survival or juvenile survival goes down, or we see things like age at first reproduction increases, right? And these are all reflections of changing carrying capacity. So when a population is growing really quickly and there's so many resources, right? Maybe female seals are 3 on average when they have a pup, but then as the population gets bigger and there's more competition, they're 4 or 5. And so we do see some balancing happening as well, to your point.
Well, it's been a fascinating discussion, and I think, yeah, those last points in particular are ones that I'm going to be going over as I continue to watch the gray seal cams. And sort of as a rhetorical question that I would like to throw out to the audience for our conclusion is, do we really have this societal tolerance for more seals when they change how we use the sea and how they change how predators use the sea, and how does that affect our relationship with other animals in the ecosystem overall? So just some really great stuff to think about. And Stephanie, I'd like to thank you so much for joining me today. I learned a lot about gray seals, and it's changed a bit of my perspective on what I'm going to see on the gray seal cam over the next several weeks.
Great. Thank you so much for having me, and thanks to explore.org for continuing this project so the wider audience can really have some insight and see this window into these really amazing creatures.
And of course, if you want to watch the gray seal cam at any time, just go to explore.org/seals. It'll take you right there. And yeah, again, thanks, Stephanie, for joining me today. No matter where you happen to be, have a great day. My name is Mike Fitz, and as we like to say at explore.org, never stop learning.